So good afternoon, and welcome to the Bayard and John Cobb Peace Lecture. This is, I should have looked, but this is our 6th, I believe, in the annual series, very generously funded by Bayard and John. I think John funded it because it's the reason that we have to allow him to keep teaching a course every year as an adjunct faculty member, but that's fine for any of you that want to teach a course and would like to endow a lectureship. We'd be more than happy to accept that as well. It is the fact that John has maintained, John and Bayard both have maintained very consistently this gift to the university, and more particularly have really supported Candace Sudarshan Kapoor, who I'm really thrilled is back with us, who taught in our Peace Studies program for some long period of time, and have supported that work. Is both personally gratifying, and I think as a Naropa community, I want to just, apart from the flowers, thank Bayard and John once again for this generous gift that they've made to us. It's a delight for me to introduce Dr. Vinh Tho to Naropa. Dr. Tho agreed to offer this Bayard and John Cobb lecture and spend some time with the Naropa community a few months ago when Judy and I had the real privilege of meeting him in Bhutan. We were introduced by email initially by Arawana Hayashi, who some of you that have been around know was a longtime faculty member at Naropa and who has been working with Dr. Tho through the Presencing Institute, work that was founded by MIT professor Otto Scharmer and is working around the world in training in peace studies, in leadership, in deep introspection, and most importantly, taking that introspection and those experiences and taking it into action around the world. So Arawana introduced us, and it just happened that we were able to go to Bhutan a couple of months later, where our hosts at the Royal University of Bhutan, we went there to sign our agreement to launch a study abroad program starting in January of next year. Our hosts hosted a dinner at which Dr. Tho, his wife Lisi, and the director of the Gross National Happiness Center joined us, Dr. Samdu Chetri. And we were able to have a pretty lively discussion about the Gross National Happiness Center, which right now Dr. Tho serves as the program director, and the ways in which the work that is going on at the Gross National Happiness Center are relevant to the work that we're doing at Naropa. Dr. Tho mentioned that he was going to be in the U.S. this month at some meetings in Boston, particularly with the Presencing Institute and with Mind and Life, another organization that we share much with, and it gave us the opportunity to invite him to come to Boulder and offer this peace lecture, which is something that's very exciting, and we're very pleased. I will mention once again, I just passed over the fact that we are starting our study abroad program in Bhutan next January, but I'm saying it again. We will be the first North American university to have a study abroad program with the Royal University of Bhutan. Will be taking place on several of the RUB campuses, and that will expand over time. And so if you have interest in that program or know anyone else that would be interested, not just Naropa students, this is a 4-credit program that would be available to other students as well. There's material outside, and you'd be welcome to take it and to talk with us about that going further. One of the real benefits of this program is, and the meetings that we had in the fall, is there will be an opportunity for the students in that program to meet with, particularly with the young people that are working with GNH, with Gross National Happiness, and I'm sure Dr. Tho will talk about some of the work that's going on in Bhutan, especially with young people. Before taking the job with the Gross National Happiness Center, Dr. Tho, and I saw in his bio it says he is Vietnamese and French. I'm Lithuanian and Belarusian, if that's relevant to people too. I just thought that was important. Dr. Tho served as with the International Committee of the Red Cross as the head of training and learning and development, really working with Red Cross staff around the world as they meet their mission to protect the lives and the dignity of victims of war and victims of internal violence. And so he comes from an impressive and incredibly difficult professional career, having done this amazing work, and found himself in Bhutan looking at how gross national happiness in the laboratory, which is the Kingdom of Bhutan, can actually be looked at, studied, analyzed, and basically exported around the world as a model of measuring social, economic, cultural activity, something that is proving to be a really powerful tool as it's being adopted by both governments, NGOs, other organizations around the world. Integrating equitable and sustainable socioeconomic development along with co-equal emphasis on environmental conservation, cultural promotion, and good governance. An incredibly ambitious task coming from a very small but very powerful kingdom in the Himalayas. And it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Tho to the Naropa community. And please join me in welcoming him.
So, President Leaf, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and dear Naropa community, it's an honor and a joy to be here today. I've followed the development from Naropa first Institute and then university since its beginning, really, but from afar. And it's my first visit here, so it's a real privilege to be here. And I would like to thank you to have given me this opportunity to share together with you today on a little bit of my life and a little bit of my work in Bhutan. Before we begin, I would like to invite us to create sort of a listening space so that we can share from the heart and listen from the heart, because this is what I will attempt to do during this talk, not only to speak out of some kind of intellectual knowledge only, but also really to try to share what really moves me, and out of what I am trying to do what I'm doing, and hoping that sharing from my heart, it might touch some of your heart. So I would like to invite you to sit in such a way that you really feel the weight of your body on the chair and your feet on the floor, and this connection with Earth, with Mother Earth, and reconnect with our body as it is sitting here in the present moment. And at the same time, feel this natural dignity of our upright position with our head open towards the sky, the infinite space that is sort of shining down on us. And how heaven and earth sort of meet in our heart. And with each heartbeat, each in and out breath, we are actually bringing together heaven and earth in our own being and radiating the strength around us. So just let us take a very short moment to listen deeply into the sound of the bell and feel this connection below, above, and all around. Thank you. So I would like to start by sharing a little bit of my life story, not for my life story's sake, but just to set the context. As President Leaf has mentioned, I'm half Vietnamese, half French, and I'm from the Vietnam War generation, which in Vietnam was called the American War and not the Vietnam War. You know, constructs different perspectives on the same issue. And of course, Vietnam War is, in at least people from my generation, very present also, I think, in Vietnam and in the United States. That it was for many of the young people in this generation the first sort of awakening to political consciousness or social awareness. And it has played a major impact in this generation. And it has played a very great role in the development of what has been called socially engaged Buddhism in Vietnam and also around the world. And this is a quite well-known picture of my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, with Dr. King, as Thich Nhat Hanh was touring the US in the early 60s, trying to bring awareness to the reality of the war and what it meant in terms of suffering for the ordinary people of Vietnam. Most of them were not really involved in the big ideological and strategic conflict that was playing out in the country, but were really simply the victim of it. So I believe that these two figures side to side, representing some kind of symbol of an awakening in America of a certain awareness about social justice and racial justice and civil rights movement and so on, and the peace movement in Vietnam itself, is sort of a nice starting point for what I would like to share with you. So war was very present in my life from the very beginning. Although I was not directly affected by the Vietnam War, I was only going in and out, and my father was a diplomat, so we were traveling. But my family is from central Vietnam, and my family became divided through the war. One part of the family siding with the North and the other one with the South. And for most people, it was not so much a choice than just a situation that was happening through what life was bringing. And but so I was sort of very aware of the reality of war, and this led me later to join the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the part of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement in the world that is working in war zone and conflict areas, armed conflict areas. So I've spent a lot of my life, many years, going from one war zone to the other, from Afghanistan to Darfur to Ivory Coast, Palestine, and so on and so forth. And having a sort of a first-hand experience of what war really means beyond what we see in the media. That was a picture that I took a few years ago in Mazar-e-Sharif, where there was a major meeting of tribe elders, and so that's northern Afghanistan. And at the same time, they had a big sort of buzkashi. It's like a national game. It's a kind of a polo game. So there was a sort of a political meeting, at the same time sort of a traditional cultural event happening in Mazar-e-Sharif. So in the preamble of the Constitution of UNESCO, there's this very famous sentence: since war begins in the mind of man, it is in the minds of man that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And of course, I've known this sentence forever, but frankly, no, I would like to share an experience, personal experience, that shed a totally different light for me on this sentence. It was early on in my career in the ICRC. Part of what we do at the ICRC stands for International Committee of the Red Cross. Part of what we do at the ICRC is visit war prisoners. according to Geneva Conventions. And so my very first prison visit was somewhere in the Middle East, and I had spent the whole morning visiting prisoners. So according to Geneva Convention, the ICRC delegates are allowed to have one-on-one interviews with detainees and ask them about the condition of their detention. So I had spent the whole morning hearing one very, very painful story after the other. And I was taking a rest in the sort of the courtyard of the prison. It was very hot, and when you know, the detainees, some of them were as young as 15, the elders were 70 and above, and all of them had very painful stories to tell. And although the International Committee of the Red Cross has as a fundamental principle neutrality and impartiality, as a human being you tend to take sides. And you tend to take sides with those who suffer the most, with the oppressed, or with the one that you perceive as being the victims. So after I had heard like one story after the other of suffering and, you know, and mistreatments and so on, I felt there was a kind of anger building up in me. And it was hard for me to look at the soldiers with a sort of, with sympathy or with empathy or with equanimity. There was sort of a resentment. And at that point, a young soldier came and sat next to me, you know, with his uniform and his machine gun, and I'd seen the soldiers, the way they were dealing with the prisoners the whole morning, and that was sort of a painful thing to witness. And this young soldier started talking with me, and I felt he really wanted to create a relationship. And at first I felt there was a resistance in me. I didn't really want to speak with him. You know, I felt some kind of an antipathy. You know, I was resisting the dialogue. But he continued. So, you know, after a while I opened up and we started talking, and he told me he was doing his, he had been drafted, and actually he wanted to become an educator, and in his community he was doing a community service. And as I listened to him, I realized he needed to tell me, you know, I'm also a human being. You know, it's just I'm in this situation. And then at one point he looked at me. He must have felt the way I felt, and he told me, "Do you think I'm evil?" And I was really touched when he told me that. I was really moved. And you know, this young man was, I don't know, early 20s, late teens, something. You know, soldiers are very young. You know, that's the thing with wars. That's what you realize when you go in war zone. Soldiers are kids. You know, the old guys, they're the officers in the back, but those in the front line, they're all kids. And suddenly I looked at him and I felt really ashamed. I really ashamed. You know, I felt, you know, here I am. I've been, you know, practicing. I've been a spiritual practitioner for years and years, and you know, I'm a part of the Red Cross. I pride myself to be neutral, but I'm not, you know. And I have not even managed to see the human being beyond the uniform, you know, under the uniform, beyond the machine gun. A young kid, helpless, and actually also a victim. And that was a real wake-up call for me. You know, I realized, well, if we want to, you know, when we say we have to build the defense of peace in the mind of man, it means something like that, you know. Can we stop discriminating the good guys, the bad guys, the victims, the perpetrators, and so on? This kind of dualistic approach to reality that is actually perpetuating conflicts, because there's always the others that are mean and bad and evil and whatever, and that we need to, you know, destroy or overcome or something like that. And I realized that although I was a humanitarian worker and, you know, I'd never held in my whole life, I never had a gun in my hand, but still I had the same mindset, you know, good guys, bad guys. So that really, that was a wake-up moment for me. And I was reminded of a poem that is well known, I guess, by many of you, that was written by my teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, during the time of the boat peoples in Vietnam. You know, when after the war, so many boat peoples were leaving Vietnam. And he wrote this poem, Called Me by My True Names, and I just want to quote a few lines, not the whole poem, where he wrote that after he had heard about a boat that had been hijacked by pirates, and a young girl had been raped and then threw herself in the drowned, and she jumped in the ocean because she couldn't bear it. And he told us, at first, naturally, he was taking side for the little girl against the pirate. And then as he meditated on that, he said, that's too easy. That I should go beyond that. And then he wrote this poem where he writes, I am a 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am a pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. And later on he says, please call me by my true names. And my true names is all of that, the little girl and the pirate, the victim and the perpetrator. So I can hear all my cries and laughs at once. So I can see that my joy and my pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion. So that was what came into my mind after this encounter with this young soldier, and meant for me as an inner experience a deeper take on what it means to try to contribute to build the defense of peace in the minds. And that led me then to later on go to Vietnam, to Bhutan, because what the other insight that I gained from being in war zone was that the physical violence that appears on the surface, that the one that makes the news, where you see bombs and victims and soldiers and tanks and planes, is just the tip of the iceberg. But in reality, the violence is structural, is systemic, and it just manifests in a very obvious way in certain moments. But the real violence is much deeper than what appears in the moment where the actual weapons, start firing. And so, working for a number of years with the Red Cross, always coming too late. We come in once the violence has already been perpetrated, once we have to help refugees, once there are victims and so on. I really ask myself, can we do anything on the preventive side to help that, these defenses in the mind can be created before it erupts in physical outer violence? So that was really the question that I was carrying with me, and that's the reason when at a certain point I decided to leave the Red Cross and go to Bhutan. And the structural violence has a number of forms. One is simply the inequity of wealth distribution. Because when you look at conflicts, you always see there's always scarcity of resources behind any conflict. Yeah, so I was in Darfur, for instance, during the worst time of the conflict there. And it was terrible what was going on in Darfur. It was a real massacre. And it was basically a war over water. In Darfur, everybody's Muslim, so it was not a religious conflict. And there's no oil or big riches like in South Sudan. There's oil. That's why there's a crisis there now. But in Darfur, there's no oil. There's nothing. There's really desert and oasis. But the land has always been shared between nomads with their cattle and then farmers with their fields. And because of climate change, the water has become scarce. And then the conflict erupted. Of course, then this is like the trigger, and then, big powers come in and arms dealers and you name it. But the beginning was that, water scarcity. And I realized that, until recently, when you look at the maps of war and you compare it with the maps of oil production, it's pretty much copy-paste, right? But the next phase will be war over water, and that will be terrible if we cannot stop it, because you can live without oil less comfortably, but we can live without oil, but you cannot live without water even a couple of days. So the level of violence that I saw in Darfur was really terrifying. And it has to do, on one hand, with the inequality of resources and what the consequences on our environment, on the ecological footprint that we have in the world. So these two elements together made me become aware that this structural systemic violence had to be sort of addressed at the root. So that's why I came to Bhutan. This is a photograph taken in one of these feeding centers in Darfur. And you know, in the feeding centers, it was a terrible experience because, you know, if the children were below a certain body mass index, then they were allowed to get some food, and so they were getting into the feeding program. And then I was monitoring some of these feeding centers, and then when I was coming back some months later, I was asking, has there been improvement? And the people in charge said, not really. And when we tried to figure out why, after a while, the mothers had to admit, well, you know, I have 4, 5, 6 children at home. You give me food for one, I have to share it. And therefore, the children were all still underfed. So we decided to say, okay, so that what we need to do is when we feed one child, we also feed their siblings. So the mother doesn't have to choose. And then when I came back a couple of months later, I asked, so has it improved? They said, well, not really. And then when we tried to find out, we found out, you know, like when you get into the food program, you get food for, let's say, 3 months. And then it stops because, you know, we cannot feed the whole population all the time. The resources are simply not available. So we found out that many mothers underfed one of their children intentionally so that they could keep being on the food program to feed the whole family. So, you know, when you realize what does it mean for a mother to have to do that, but that was what the price they had to pay in order simply for the whole family to survive. You know, but what a heartbreak. You know, but that's the world we're living in. You know, that's the consequences of this inequality, of this, you know, completely unfair distribution of resources, and of the way we are dealing with our environment. These are the consequences. So I believe right now we are, as a mankind, at a crossroad. And being optimistic by nature, I think it's not too late. But on the other hand, I feel the window of opportunity is not very large. So the time for change is now. And I really believe that we have a tremendous responsibility towards the generations to come. And we have a responsibility to empower the next generation to take over this path to, you know, direct mankind in a direction that is sustainable. And I see 4 main challenges that we are confronted with. The first one is a spiritual challenge, and in my view, it is almost a fundamental challenge. Because you see, we've been working, the current dominant model, economic model, is working on the assumption of something called the Homo economicus, which is what is used to make all the macroeconomics models. And this model of the human being considers the human being as being a purely rational and narrowly self-interested actor, and so on and so forth. You all know that. And when you look at what kind of image is it of the human being, actually it's an image of what is called in Buddhism the poisons of the mind. So the poisons of the mind, you know, ignorance, greed, hatred. You can also add jealousy and pride, but let's start with 3. Enough for today, I guess. The poison of the mind are sort of they're illness in human consciousness. Yeah? They're the disease of human consciousness, but it's presented as that's the human nature, that's what we are, right? And from this point of view, our economic system is just working on the basis of this assumption that's who we are. And many of you know that the wheel of life with the 3 poisons of the mind in the center being like the driver for samsara, you know, leading to more ignorance, more greed, and more violence. And when we look at the current system, well, that's pretty much an illustration of what we have here, the poisons of the mind in action. So from this point of view, modern economic system is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. It tells us that's what the human being is about, therefore we have to model a system that is adjusting to this human being, you know, the sum of all egoism by some miraculous kind of intervention, so-called the invisible hand of the market, will make sure that the sum of all egoism somehow will benefit the common good by the so-called trickling down effect, which we have not seen working anywhere. So that's you know, if we don't change the way we understand ourselves as human beings, and I don't mean it in a theoretical way, but that's an inner experience, who are we as human beings, I think it will be very different to bring any lasting change in the system. And you know, on the other hand, Buddhist psychology, as most of you know, is based on a totally different assumption of what it is to be human. That fundamentally there's a basic goodness in human being, and basic positive qualities like openness, intelligence, compassion, altruism, and so on and so forth. You know, these are really part of our humanness, of our beingness, and that the poisons are actually like a veil covering our true nature, rather than the other way around, our true nature being ignorance and greed and hatred, and we have somehow to manipulate the human beings through what kind of methods to sort of keep these horrible not qualities, but you know, attributes somehow in check and balance by law enforcement and jails and police and armies and all the rest. So you see, we have two really opposite kind of assumption of what it is to be human. And this assumption of our separation from ourselves, from who we truly are, also alienates us from nature. This is a view from the Genet Center land in Bhutan. I'll say a bit more about it later. And you know, what is wonderful about one of the wonderful aspects of the culture in Bhutan is that the relationship to nature as a being is still alive. And I think we need that to reclaim the beingness of nature. So nature is not a thing, an it, that we can simply, you know, brutalize and utilize for our own egoistic means, but it's a being, and we have a I, thou, or I, you relationship with the beings of nature, so that our relationship with nature can be based on something else than just greed and exploitation. And you know, this is sort of a kind of scenario that we're looking at until the late 70s. Since the beginning of time until the late 70s, basically mankind was using up less than what the Earth is able to produce, and then we just crossed the limit somewhere during the late 70s. Now we're using up about 1.5 planet, meaning that what we consume in a year, the Earth needs 18 months to actually produce. And you know, according to projection, by 2050, just with moderate business as usual growth, we would come to need 3 planets, which is, well, obviously impossible. So this is the first crossroad we need to, you know, the threshold. Are we able to come to a rapid reduction in the way we exploit the planet, so that by 2050 we are back to 1 planet rather than up to 3 planets? And the next challenge that I've already briefly mentioned is simply the way wealth is distributed, or rather not distributed worldwide. So that this enormous gap of income between the North and the South, and now it's even reflecting in the North country itself. Like in the US, you know, the Gini index of inequality has been constantly rising over the last year. So this sort of fundamental split in distribution of wealth is not only anymore a north-south problem, but it's even within rich or first world societies apparent. And on the other hand, you know, here down on the bottom line you have the Gini index, which is the inequality factor, and on the upper side, you have the consequences in social problems, health and social problems. And you see that more equal society, this is only OECD countries, so only rich countries, but even in rich countries this applies. You see, like, when societies are more equal, like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, then they have much less social problems. And then when you look at the very top, you have the United States, which has a very high Gini index, so a high inequality, and has the highest of health and social problems overall of all the developed countries. And that is absolutely correlated, inequality and health and social problems. So I think that's really the next absolutely crucial issue. How do we reduce inequality within rich societies and around the world? And the next challenge is the leadership challenge. So, can we move from serving short-term specific interests, vested interest groups, versus striving for the happiness and well-being of all? And I just put up two figures who are somehow symbolic of great leadership. One is His Majesty the Fourth King of Bhutan, who at the age of 52 gave up the throne and gave the power back to the people, although he was at the height of his popularity, while we see that most other leaders in the world just do whatever that they can to stay in power, willing to even destroy half their population just to keep the power in their hands. And the other one is Nelson Mandela, which I wanted to honor today, as he has passed away a few months ago, and he was also one of these shining stars of contemporary leadership, being able to bring forgiving and reconciliation in a country that could have easily gone into a brutal civil war. So these are some of the, I believe, the main challenges we are confronted with. And when we try to look at the root causes, well, I believe that one of the root causes is really the way we think development and the way we measure progress. And that's not really a new idea, although it's been only in recent years that it has gained a real momentum internationally. But actually, I would like to share with you a short video from Bob Kennedy in a speech in 1968, where the analysis he does of the problem of GDP and GDP measurement is still completely valid today.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
So this was 1968. And a few weeks later, Bob Kennedy was assassinated. So I think in this short speech, really, Bob Kennedy has managed to really, in a few sentences, point out exactly what the problem is with the current economic model of GDP fixation on economic growth, and how what we measure with the GDP economy is not what is really important to neither to people and even much less so for all sentient beings. And recent research has shown that very, very clearly. So here we have, it's written in French, but it means a GDP, real GDP per inhabitant in thousands of dollars, and evaluation of life satisfaction. And when you see, for instance, up here in, you have the growth of the GDP in the US since 1955, so it has been a very impressive growth, but the life satisfaction has not grown at all. Rather, it's slightly declining in the last years. And then we can go on with all the other statistics to see that actually, once you are beyond meeting the basic needs, physical needs, there's no more, hardly any correlation between the growth of the GDP and the growth of well-being and happiness within the population. And so that is one of the important aspects of gross national happiness, to try to show that you can measure development in a different way, and that you can orient progress in a different way. And I started by putting up the image of a mandala, because the mandala is like a fractal. It can be seen as a representation of the universe or of the mind, but also of a society or an organization. And the four doors of the mandala can somehow be put in relationship with the four pillars of gross national happiness, and also remind us of the interdependence of the various factors within society. So fundamentally, gross national happiness, the way it has been developed in Bhutan, is several things. The first thing is a development strategy. It's a vision. What should development aim for? And in this case, it's the goal of development is to increase the happiness of well-being of people and all sentient beings, and not just economic growth. Economic growth being just one means amongst many how we can improve lives of people. And then it's an indicator system and an index which is used to survey the well-being of people. In Bhutan, it's done every 3 years. Then it's a policy screening tool used by what is called the Gross National Commission, which is a planning commission of the government of Bhutan, to see whether the projects and the laws align with the values of gross national happiness. And then finally, and very importantly so, and that's what we are trying to do at the Gross National Happiness Center, it's a shift in individual and collective consciousness. Because we deeply believe that this shift in the way we perceive and orient development is only possible if at the same time we have a shift in consciousness. So we could not only impose it through laws and rules and regulation and so on and so forth, but it has to be a shift. For instance, a shift from a consumerist society that is looking at increasing well-being by consuming more stuff, more things, more relation, more everything, more experience, to a shift that is into a more qualitative approach. You see, limitless growth in the material world exists only in one case, and that's cancer cell, right? All the other natural growth is always limited. So cancer cell is the only example in the material world of endless growth. And that's what GDP is doing to us. Yeah, one aspect of society is taking over and sort of destroying all the other aspects of society. And while, on the other hand, inner growth, spiritual growth, that can really truly be endless. There's no limit to that. So we need to refocus our attention from limitless physical material growth to orienting inner growth as a goal that can really, be in a way limitless, while having respect and the limited resources we have in the physical world. And the four pillars of gross national happiness are good governance, preservation of the environment, preservation and diversity of culture, and equitable and sustainable economic development. And I've put them in sort of in relationship with the four immeasurable mind, which all of you who are somehow interested or practicing Buddhism are very familiar with. Because actually what I wanted to say with that, you know, if you want to have a shift in structure, in the policies, you also have to have underlying values that give meaning. So it cannot only be a purely political or structural process. So this inner shift has to be based, needs a foundation on inner values. And, you know, for instance, the four immeasurable minds are a very good basis. Like, you know, what is loving kindness? This is the intention to bring about happiness and well-being for all. And what is a good government? A good government is a government that is trying to create the conditions, the environment in which this happiness and well-being can come about. Or, you know, what is the preservation environment has to do with our ability to relate to nature in a, as I said before, I-thou relationship. So we cannot have compassion with a thing, we have compassion with beings. So if we become aware of the beingness of our natural world, then we can have this kind of approach that is, you know, not preserving the environment is simply plain stupid, right? Because that's, you know, like a kind of slow and not that slow suicide. But doing it out of egoistic intention is not quite enough. We, you know, our ability to open up our heart to the reality of the suffering of all beings and of nature is really, I believe, what grounds a true ecology, a deep ecology, and you know, and so on. Or for instance, you know, equitable and sustainable economic development has to do with equanimity and inclusiveness, because it includes not only all that are here now, but also all that will come after us. So it's in space and in time, and so on. So I don't really have time to go in detail on that, but you know, what I wanted to show is that when we look at gross national happiness, it's not only a technical issue, it's really, you know, how do we appeal to this fundamental goodness in human nature? How can we nurture this? And how do we come to these kind of values? So this is, I guess, a well-known sort of, I don't know how to call it, prayer or dedication. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the supreme joy that is beyond all sorrows. May all beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. So this is a kind of, I would like to say, like cultural atmosphere out of which something like gross national happiness can be born. And we had last year a very interesting dialogue with people coming from many different countries and tradition and religion to say, so if that could be an example of a Buddhist, because Bhutan is a Buddhist country, so that could be an example of a Buddhist foundation, what would it be in a Muslim country, in a Christian country, in a Jewish country, or in a secular country? You know, what are then the values that we can, you know, that are universal enough to underlie kind of common intentions? And, you know, this is what His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been trying to emphasize in his last book, Beyond Religion, which are the common fundamental human values that we can share, not because we're Buddhists or Christians or Jews or whatever, but because we're human beings, you know. So these are the kind of questions we are really looking into. And now I would like you to hear former Prime Minister Jigme Tinley describing his take on gross national happiness, because he's really one of the founding fathers of this approach.
G&H, or gross national happiness, is the philosophy that had guided Bhutan's development process for about now 40 years. It is based on the belief that development must serve a purpose. That development's role is not simply to promote continuous and limitless economic growth, which is what GDP or the conventional economic models tend to do. And that again, within a finite environment, within a finite world. There are bounds within which growth can take place. Natural, social, resources, and so forth. And so G&H is based on the belief that development must be human-centered, and that its objective must be to create those conditions that will enable the human individual to achieve what is most important to him. And that happens to be happiness. And then again, happiness, we believe, is a condition that can be attained when one is able to balance the needs of the body with those of the mind, the physical and the mental needs being balanced. And likewise, the balance between the spiritual needs of the human individual and the material needs. And so it is a human-centered, holistic, sustainable, and inclusive development approach. Now more and more people who are dissatisfied with the result of pursuing an economic development that is no longer seen to be sustainable, they are seeing G&H as an alternative development paradigm.
So the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, Jigme Waitinle, is the chairman of the board of the Gross National Happiness Center. So this is then the 9 domains that are measured in the surveys of gross national happiness. I won't go into that now because of time constraint, because I would still like to say a few words about the G&H Center, which I'm working for. So the G&H Center Bhutan has three main objectives. One is to create a place where people can learn about G&H, understand G&H. So I've taken these 3 concept that Otto Scharmer has developed in his theory U of open mind, open heart, and open will, which I think describe pretty well what we're trying to do. So learning G&H is like, you know, can we overcome the kind of preconceived idea that we that we've received from childhood on through the school system and so on, so that we can look at the world with fresh eyes. And then our aim is to create a community where these principles are not only taught intellectually but can be experienced through the way of community life that we're doing. And I believe that in a way this is not very different from at least some aspects of what you are trying to do here at Naropa Institute or Naropa University, or I believe it was certainly also the intention of Shögyön Trungpa Rinpoche to create sort of a model of what could an enlightenment society be like, and this is very close to our heart too. And finally, it's about implementing G&H, which means you know, helping people who want to go back in their own context, or get their organization, their school, their business, their country. How can we support them in implementing G&H inspired programs or projects in Bhutan as well as internationally? So this is the master plan that we are, you see there's a dzong here in the lower part, and then there's like houses, and the round one is a meditation hall, then more housing. So it's in Bumtang in central Bhutan, and it's supposed to be a place where about 300 participants will be able to live there at any given time, and about 200 staff, community member will live there. And the idea is to use the best of Bhutanese traditional architecture. You know, this is like mud-rammed earth and beams and bamboos and like that, and use at the same time the best of green technology, like you know, zero waste and completely off the grid as far as energy is concerned. So we're at the very beginning of building infrastructure. The program's already well on the way. I will just show you in a minute an example of one of the programs we've conducted, but the infrastructure is still at the very beginning. We have the land, and we are starting now with the first constructions. As you can imagine, it's quite a financial, so fundraising issue to be able. So I wanted to, before I end with a little program, the one before last presentation, to remind us that one of the very strong statements that Thich Nhat Hanh told me when I told him I was going to Bhutan, working for the Happiness Center. He told me, please remember, it's not a way towards happiness. Happiness has to be the way itself from the first minute you start doing this work. So it was really the advice he gave me when I went there, and so I wanted to share that with you. And I have this calligraphy in my office in Thimphu as a reminder. You know, I should be aware that it's not somewhere in the far distance. One day we will make it, but it's here and now. It's happening here and now. It won't ever happen. And let me end with a short video that shows you an example of the international programs that we are conducting, because it also shows that there's a real interest worldwide for gross national happiness now, and I think that's really encouraging.
One of the key dimensions of how the old economy works is the orientation and fixation to improving GDP, although we know from statistics that more GDP does not translate in developed countries to more well-being.
Beyond GDP, to some extent, conveys the idea that material development is important up to a point. But beyond that point, we need to look at other indicators and other measures of well-being.
Well, I think it's really talking about changing our economy from something that serves just a few to something that serves the many.
Being able to have these discussions about the challenges between happiness and progress and prosperity, I think that'll be really, really helpful.
I am looking forward to working on this global issue of well-being across national and institutional borders, using dialogue and combining personal and social transformation. I believe that this is not only possible, but vital.
The Global Wellbeing and G&H Lab is a project in which we're working with an international group of 25 participants who've been selected because they're all in some way working on global well-being. And what we're doing is taking them together to really interesting, high potential areas for innovation, such as Brazil and Bhutan, and giving them a lot of support and space for them to reflect and then prototype, innovate new projects and new ideas when they go back home.
If this is a tiny little microcosm of how to do things differently, I think that will be a hell of a spark for the future.
What the lab is trying to do is say, let's take people out of their normal environment, their comfort zones, take them to places where they can be inspired or challenged or provoked, where they can connect with like-minded people, and where they can see things in a way that they haven't before. A lot of the first part of the journey is about sensing, taking in what's out there, not coming there with your answers, with your preconceived notion of what you're going to see and go, aha, okay, check, 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 that's what I expected. but rather to really go there with an open mind.
We took our time to be in the community, to walk around, to engage with very different levels of the community, from the police to local inhabitants to civil society people who were trying to bring about change.
What was surprising was the inspiration. So we saw entrepreneurs, we saw a community that was trying to deal with gang violence and crime and come up with unconventional solutions to that. So we experienced the urbanization, the tensions in these very unequal societies, and then we radically and very quickly moved into the Amazon. We had amazing conversations there where people were able to share the kind of work that they were doing and what they were hoping to see come out of the lab.
We have to have the corporate social responsibility trying to change the system from within, while we have people creating different models that drive the market to say, we're going to choose that if you guys don't change.
When we stepped off the boat, we got to meet people in communities that were working to really live in balance with nature and engage with the modern world in a way that preserved their values and their indigenous knowledge.
The sense of deep and profound relationship between people and nature was very important to see. Both the ability to work with the natural environment to produce goods or to sustain livelihoods, but also the sense of how that held community ways of being that seemed to be essentially sustainable. An appreciation started to emerge about what makes a community that is well. Money per se, what we found, was not the primary driver for happiness and well-being.
A lot of our sessions in the mornings involved people sitting with a practice of mindfulness or meditation, just to resist the urge to constantly fill the space up with ideas and thoughts.
Mindfulness is about reclaiming the power of our attention and directing it intentionally so that our attention is aligned with our intentions. What we measure is what we are attentive to, therefore the importance of the indicators. If we shift what we measure, we become aware and attentive to other things, and therefore there can be a system shift.
I think for a lot of people, being taken to some really challenging and also inspiring parts of Brazil opened up their thinking about their own work. To come back with fresh perspective and with maybe some courage and some inspiration to do something differently. And I think that's what we started to see happening in Brazil.
There are many attempts to develop new ways to measure progress and development, but the only country in the world who's trying to do it on a country-wide level is Bhutan. It's a unique opportunity to observe what are the challenges, what works, what doesn't work. So in a way, although it's a very small country, what's happening here is very important because it is some kind of an experiment the rest of the world can learn from.
Within Bhutan, the government has really been promoting gross national happiness as a way of measuring how the country is doing, not just in relation to economic growth, which is what GDP would reflect, but how the nation as a whole is doing in terms of well-being and happiness. The second half of the lab brought all the participants to Bhutan for a deep immersion experience in GNH. So we started off with a welcoming and a ceremonial tree planting, and we were really lucky to have Her Royal Highness Ashi Khezang Wangchuk to open and welcome us here.
Bhutan seeks to balance equitable and sustainable economic development with environmental conservation, cultural promotion, and good governance. This is why we welcome the opportunity to work with distinguished global leaders and thinkers such as you.
We then had a series of speakers from the government and policy level.
When the Prime Minister talks about Bhutan's leadership role in developing this new economic paradigm or new development paradigm, he very often uses the term, he says, it has a purpose, and its purpose is human happiness and the well-being of all life forms.
We have trained all our school leaders and deputy school leaders in infusing ideas of gross national happiness into the overall life of the school.
Then it was going to the field and visiting a number of institutions, civil society organizations, to see the way it's implemented on the ground level.
We opted to reduce plastic waste by refusing to eat packaged food on all days except Wednesday.
We had been exposed more to the outer side of GNH, policy making and its implementation in the country. And now we wanted to encourage the participant to reflect what does it mean for them personally in terms of values, in terms of life's purpose, meaning. So we organized this walking pilgrimage to Tiger's Nest, which is one of the sacred places in Bhutan. The pilgrimage is always at the same time an outer journey to a physical place in space, but always also an inner journey.
That question of inner transformation, I think, is central to the journey of this lab, to really understand what is it that we need to shift in ourselves, how do we model that or inspire it for others, and then how can that become a movement for social change. One of the explicit goals of the Global Wellbeing and GNH Lab is to create living examples of how we can actually model this change in the world, and that's based on the idea that we need to prototype, we need to try out new things, revise them, go back to the drawing board, and then start to see how they can be scaled up.
Prototyping ideas may be an advancement of a piece of work that we're already doing. For others, it's taking an idea that we had already and move them into action in order to use them as an instrument for institutional and system-wide transformation.
5 prototypes emerged from the discussions and workshops. One prototype looks at ways to raise awareness of the Genuine Progress Indicator movement in the United States and assist its continued growth.
GPI in the States has 3 specific components. One component is supporting all the states who are moving in this direction.
Another prototype aims to create a transformation hub in Brazil, which would bring people and organizations together to work towards a more sustainable, equitable and just society.
That hub takes us to other hubs, and you connect all these, you create a whole movement of mindful actions.
The GNH Center Bhutan prototype further develops ideas around manifesting Bhutan's unique balanced development philosophy of gross national happiness, which seeks to integrate equitable and sustainable socio-economic development with environmental conservation.
This is the GNH Center's programming elements, of which we realize that there's really kind of an international program part and then a local Bhutan program part.
The GNH in Business prototype focuses on how to inspire business leaders to integrate well-being into their work.
Our prototype is essentially to engage business leaders with this purpose, to change the way we frame and conduct our economy from us versus them to a business value proposition which builds community by better serving society and nature and engaging the creativity and potential of all citizens.
Whose development is a prototype that sets out to change the way Indian policymakers think about and pursue development and create a shift from rapid economic growth with little regard to its quality or distribution to an economy that prioritizes the well-being of citizens and protects rather than exploits the environment.
This isn't built on GDP, it's an absolutely stark challenge to GDP.
This is actually proving that GDP doesn't work for the people.
On the last day, it felt like as if we were playing a symphony together and all these different instruments had come in a certain harmony.
We have really come to some concrete ideas for how to ground going beyond GDP in real practical projects.
All these leaders and change agents go back to Brazil, to the US, to India, or wherever they are situated. And there they work and do action with what they have come up with in the lab, in the process so far.
It's given me a sense of strength, a sense of motivation to keep going forward, and most excitingly, it's given me this amazing new network of wonderful friends and colleagues and peers who I'm really looking forward to working with in the future.
It's made me realize that true system transformation really starts with individuals, that the ability to transform the economy or transform our healthcare system ultimately depends on the ability and willingness of the individuals within the system to transform themselves.
I still feel that from this lab, we human beings, we still have a hope for the future. That is what I came to know.
So I guess that's the word of the end. I came to know that we human beings, we still have a hope for the future. Thank you. Do we still have a few minutes for an exchange? Questions, remarks? Yeah.
You said the model of growth would be the cancer cell, which kills its host. Wouldn't the tapeworms? The cancer. I do karaoke. The cancer cell will eventually kill its host, whereas the tapeworm, bobby lice would be sustainable.
Thank you, Dr. Till. The point about having a system or an approach that's human-centered is wonderful, and on the other hand, when we talk about all sentient beings, we talk about going beyond human-centered. And I think that's sometimes difficult for us to consider what that really means. And I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Well, when the Prime Minister said it's human-centered, I think what he's pointing out at that right now it's economy-centered, right? The focus of attention is economic growth. And, you can have politicians from any side, any party, almost everywhere in the world. They might disagree on how to reach growth, but basically everybody's saying it's about economic growth. And so what the Prime Minister is trying to say there is that, we have to realize that economic growth is just a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So I think, speaking to international audiences, it's important for him to mention the fact that, it's moving from being centered on the sort of the economy as a goal towards what is really bringing happiness and well-being. And as Dr. Tashi Coleman aptly mentioned here, actually, usually Prime Minister always says happiness for people and well-being for all life forms, which is, it was mentioned there. So I think it's not, centering on human well-being at the cost of happiness of all other life forms. And frankly, if we are looking at it from the point of view of interdependence, mutual interdependence, there's no such a thing as the well-being of one life form at the cost of the well-being of other life forms. And that's that's the kind of assumption we have had until, that has been predominantly there, that we can sustain human development without taking into consideration the well-being of life forms. So definitely in the case of GNH, it is about happiness of all people and the well-being of all life forms. Therefore, ecology being one of the 4 pillars of gross national happiness. Sorry.
Thank you for joining us. From your perspective, can you give us a sense of how gross national happiness is shaping the education in Bhutan? What are you noticing? And what could we maybe be inspired by?
Well, I think Naropa University has been involved in the development of including or developing gross national happiness in education. There was the 2009 Gross National Happiness in Education Conference. I believe that some of the participants here in the room were there, part of this conference. And a lot has been implemented in Bhutan. My feeling, though, is it's been a bit scattered. So we have a lot of different projects. We have Lomon, you know, with Tsongkhap Khyentse Rinpoche doing some things. Then we had the GNH in education movement. Then we had the Green School for Green Bhutan from Lompo Thakur. Then we had the Finnish you know, experts coming in Paro Teacher Training College, and so on and so forth. So there's many very interesting and very good attempts to introduce elements of gross national happiness in the school, being it mindfulness, being it developing more social and emotional learning elements within the curriculum, but we still lack to have a comprehensive sort of approach. So actually, Gross National Happiness Center is now partnering with Mind and Life Institute in order to try to support that, and we will start by mapping what has already been done and then assessing it and seeing where the gaps are and how we can contribute to you know, have something that would be then countrywide, and a countrywide implementation of elements like mindfulness and compassion in the school, the contemplative dimension of education, in teacher training and in the classrooms, and social and emotional learning, and so on. And I spoke with, you know, with Judith Leaf this morning, and I mentioned it also to President Leaf. I was also having breakfast with Judith this morning, and my hope is that really Naropa University will be one of our partners to, you know, to work together on that, because I feel it's quite an important project. If we could model that, you know, against prototype that in Bhutan, that could be really an inspiration. And my hope that would be that next step would be then implementing it in Vietnam. So that's sort of grand hopes, but you know, again, we need to have hopes and visions. So yeah, I really feel it's a very crucial part of GNH is this shift in consciousness, and we need to change the way education is formatting the youth if we want to, you know, to have a sustainable GNH development in Bhutan and all over the world, really.
This will be the last question. Hi, hello. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the talk, Dr. Tho. That was fascinating. I've actually been following this kind of international politics of happiness for a couple of years now, and one question that's always come up to me is how it gets translated into policy. You mentioned in the talk about it being a policy screening tool. But from my observations about the kind of growth of national measures of well-being across the world, they're remaining at the level of measures at the moment. I've not actually seen any concrete policy changes because of it. So I'm just curious what your views on that. Have you noticed any policy decisions, or with your experience with GNH, have you managed to apply it in a policy arena?
Well, definitely in Bhutan there are many examples, but Bhutan is a bit like the exception to the rule, and it's also a tiny little country. And in the end, it's not really, I mean, as we heard in the video, Bhutan is like a lab. So the interesting thing about Bhutan, I mean, you know, if Bhutan can implement it, it's wonderful. But of course, that's not going to change, you know, Bhutan being squeezed between China and India. You know, and Bhutan having a population of 750,000 inhabitants, you know, the way Bhutan is developing will not change the course of event for mankind. So it's really, the challenge is really, can there be a system shift on a grander scale? Well, several observations. One is, like, for instance, you saw here Governor Skitzhaber from Oregon was there. When he came back to, was one of our programs, and when he came back to Oregon, he convened a meeting of governors, fellow governors, and 12 governors came to Oregon. Or I'm not sure if the meeting was in Oregon, but it was convened by the governor of Oregon. And apparently, we just had the Global Presencing Forum in Boston, and we heard from the First Lady of Oregon that you know, there's been really some progress in trying to implement, if not exactly GNH, at least GPI, which is Genuine Progress Indicators, in the measurement of the development and the progress of a number of states. And I think it's a first important step, because when change what we measure, we become attentive to different aspects of what society needs, and that can lead then to change. In the case of Oregon, I believe there's been a very important effort in the healthcare in Oregon. The other things that I've observed is that in Western countries in Europe, it's becoming a very strong civil society movement, grassroots movement that is starting to have a real influence on government. For instance, in Germany now, the new so-called big coalition that just came to power with the new elections has really made a commitment towards their voters that they would reorient, for instance, the energy policy of Germany, completely getting rid of nuclear power. Denmark has committed to becoming 100% green energy in the 20 years to come. So I think there is a shift. The question is will the shift be sustainable, strong enough, that there will be a real global shift. But my feeling is that, it's not whether change going to happen, yes or no, because we have come really at a dead end. So for me, the question is more, how much suffering will it take until we change? So we have the choice, either, we have enough consciousness, enough awareness, enough mindfulness to make changes before it's too late, or there's so much suffering coming in that we have to change. So it's really about, can we bring about change by alleviating as much suffering as possible, or how many natural catastrophes, wars, and destruction will it take until we absolutely realize we don't have a choice, we need to change. And the other thing is, do we have enough prototypes, enough pilots, enough examples, even if they're small and modest, that can, serve as example when the new arises? We already know to a certain extent what to do and how to do it, rather than waiting until the old has collapsed and then what now? Like it happened, for instance, with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. It collapsed and then, so what now? There was no model how to do it differently, so basically it was taking in the Western model with the consequences that we saw. I think it was the last question, I'm sorry. I think it went time constraint. Thank you very much.